Okay, so let's start. So today we want to finish the discussion on TCP. Uh, the first topic that we want to start with is the TCP timer management. In our discussion of transport layer protocols, we have seen that if a acknowledgement to a packet does not come back in a certain amount of time called a timeout interval, the transmitter retransmits the packet because either the packet has been lost at the receiver or the acknowledgement has been lost. The transmitter or the sender has no way of knowing what happened, so it just retransmits the packet. Now, the important question is, how will you determine what is this amount of timeout interval, this quantity of time? This is the topic that we are going to start with initially, okay? And then we will move to some other concepts. So this retransmission timeout or RTO, so this is know that whenever a segment is sent, for every individual segment, a timer is started. If the segment is acknowledged before the timer expires, the timer is stopped. And if the timer expired before the acknowledgement comes, segment is retransmitted. Now, what is this retransmission timeout? The timer interval before, the interval after which retransmission might happen if there is no acknowledgement. Now, the round trip time can be an RTO. It can give you some idea of RTO, right? The round trip time, that you observe within what time you are getting back the acknowledgement for some particular segment in the very recent past, and you just consider some constant multiple of that to be your RTO. So this is a very simple minded solution. But the round trip time estimation is quite difficult in the transport layer. Why is that? If you compare the round trip time distribution, okay, say in the data link layer and in the transport layer, this is the typical distribution. Say the data link layer is been implemented as Ethernet 802.11, the wired Ethernet, classic Ethernet that you see everywhere. And if you look at the probability distributions in the data link layer, the variation of the curve is much less. So if the mean delay from the plot is about 20 microsecond, it is more or less guaranteed that if you move along, say 3 sigma or something around the mean value, the 3 times the standard deviation or some interval to the left and to the right of the mean value, you are more or less guaranteed it will remain within that. Okay, delay wouldn't be more than that. Okay, because data link layer, it is much simpler the way the packets are actually transferred to the data link layer entity at the receivers. We will study them when we study the data link layer. You will find it is much simpler. There is no complicated routing, not much scope of random behavior, nothing. Okay. So you can send your RTO interval to be just outside maybe a 3 sigma limit of this curve, as is shown by this T. Unfortunately, the corresponding curve for the transport layer delays is much flatter and much more spread out, which means that it makes it difficult to set what should be a good timeout interval. So there are two choices. One choice is you move far away to the right of the curve, so T2. If you do that, it is more or less guaranteed that you won't have too much too much of any issues. But then the problem is that you are probably being too optimistic. You are just saying in T2, in setting T2, you are waiting till T2, right? That's a huge interval of time. Okay, massive interval of time and that too in milliseconds probably. Okay, before resending So you should have sent before that, because anyways the packet probably is lost. If you have not heard back anything within the T2 interval, with high, I mean, the chances are that it is lost. Okay. Because it won't get transmitted in T2, that probability is very, very low, as you can see, which means that the probability of it getting lost is high. The other solution is you set it to be T1, which is a very too much optimistic or extremely aggressive value choice. Now you are saying that, okay, earlier I was waiting for too much time. I should have sent out the packet much earlier. Now let me set it to T1, which is kind of in the middle of the curve, around 25 milliseconds. This also is quite bad, because what happens is you are now too impatient. You are now thinking, oh, within 25 milliseconds I have not got it, but okay, then immediately I'll retransmit. But there is substantial portion of the curve to the right hand side of T1, which you are completely ignoring. So there is substantial amount of probability to the right of that the packet would actually have a round trip time more than T1, which you are completely ignoring. Okay, how do I find out the probability? It's basically the area of the curve between this x-axis and this curve. This area, which you can find by integrating whatever is the equation of this curve to the right of T1. So this is a problem. Okay, so either you are getting too optimistic or you are getting too pessimistic. Okay, so I think the first one is probably, I think I made a mistake. The first one is you are too optimistic that, okay, I will wait, maybe this will go, it is taking time, but it will get delivered. And the second one is too pessimistic. Oh, within 25 milliseconds, I have not got anything acknowledgement. That means it is lost. Both are untrue. And in addition, the variation of within very short intervals of time, the round trip time, actual round trip times can vary. So for segment number 100, it was 30 millisecond. For segment number 101, it can become 60 millisecond. Then again, for segment number 105, it can again become 90 millisecond, like that. So within a very short interval of time, it can vary widely. All this means the moral of the story is that we have to constantly track the timeout interval and constantly keep on changing it based on a continuous measurement of the network performance. You measure round trip time, no problem. But your estimation of the RTO interval, it should not be a constant multiple of round trip time. Okay. It should be more complicated than that. Okay, it should take into account how much this round trip time variable is also varying. Okay, for example, if you have taken any basic course on statistics, why do people study the concept of standard deviations and variance? Because the mean is a representative of the population, no doubt, but the mean is not always a very good representative of the population in case your probability distribution is flat and widespread. If the probability distribution is very thin and very sharp, okay, then okay, mean is a very good estimate of the population, but you don't know a priori, right? So if your probability distribution is known to be very a flat curve like this, then you need some knowledge of the standard deviation and variance. Mean is not the correct representation of a probability distribution. In 1988, a scientist called Von Jacobson, very famous in this domain, he came up with certain schemes to estimate. He wrote a very famous influential paper. You can search for Jacobson 1988 paper on RTT estimation, etc. You will still get it. Now, how does he do it? Well, first of all, for each connection, the TCP maintains a variable called SRTT, smoothed round trip time, which is the best current estimate of the round trip time to the destination. It is basically the round trip time, only that it takes history into consideration, little bit of history into consideration. What it does is initially the SRTT 0, initially that value is 0. Then at every new RTT measurement, the successful acknowledgement coming back before the timer expires, if you consider that to be a round trip time, then it updates the round trip time SRTT variable to be some alpha multiple of the old SRTT plus 1 minus alpha multiple of the measured round trip time, that is R. Okay, so this is exponentially weighted moving average. The reason why this is called exponentially weighted is if you keep on expanding this recurrence relation, okay, in terms of SRTT 0, SRTT 1, etc., you will find that there are multiples of alpha, alpha square, etc., etc., etc. coming up, multiplied with 1 minus alpha on the old values of R. So then SRTT 0 is 0, SRTT 1 is 1 minus alpha R, SRTT 2 will be alpha into SRTT 1 plus 1 minus alpha R1 or R2, whatever. In this way, what you will find that the old values of R, measured values, their importance in the overall sum calculation of the new sum decreases. Why does it decrease? Because both alpha and 1 minus alpha are smaller than 1. Typically, alpha is called a smoothing factor. Okay, typically that is set to be 7 by 8, and then 1 minus alpha is 1 by 8. These factors determine how long do you remember old R values and how much importance you give to new R values. If 1 minus alpha is very high, then you are giving a lot of importance to the new R value. However, if 1 minus alpha is relatively small, then you are giving relatively less importance to the new R value and relatively more importance probably to the older R values, etc. I mean, I am saying relatively always, okay? Because remember, alpha multiplied by 1 minus alpha is smaller than 1 minus alpha. So you always give more importance to the most recent value. But how much of that more importance you are giving, that is controlled by the parameter alpha. Okay. So essentially, this is if you have taken courses on digital signal processing, this type of equations essentially is low pass filtering, okay, of SRTT, and hence this is called smoothing. What happens is if there are temporal noises which has affected one RTT, but that noise is very temporary, it won't last for long. This multiplication by alpha factors kill it off after certain amount of time, so that your overall SRTT estimates quite far away from the noisy intervals, okay, are not that much affected by the noise. Initially, the noise would affect some of the estimates, but then the influence of the noise on the estimation would decrease. Okay. So this is basically about SRTT. However, SRTT is not RT. Okay, SRTT is not the timer round trip timeout interval. We have not. SRTT is not that. So what to do? Initial versions of TCP used to use a constant multiple of SRTT, like 2 into SRTT. However, as I mentioned, this is not good because this becomes, because RTT fluctuation itself is too high. SRTT can also fluctuate within a short amount of time. So and this happens at high load actually, because usually traffic is modeled as through a Poisson arrival process, and under such queuing theory during theoretical models, if you analyze the traffic, again, I will not go into the details. There are separate courses on performance modeling of computer networks in our department, which if you take, you will study those in details. But in a Poisson distribution, Poisson arrival processes where the arrival times follow a Poisson distribution, those they are at high load, it can be shown that the variance actually, the RTT fluctuates a lot. So now just constant multiplication of SRTT to calculate the timeout interval is not correct. Okay, so timeout interval should now take into account the variation of RTT. Okay, variance or something similar to it. How does TCP do it? Well, TCP maintains another variable called RTT var. This is calculated as beta times the old value of RTT var plus 1 minus beta times absolute value of SRTT minus R. Okay, typically beta is said to be 3/4. And then the round trip timeout interval is said to be the maximum value of SRTT plus 4 into RTT var and 1 second. So it is at least 1 second. This is a convention which TCP follows. This is slightly kind of an conservative estimate, but this is how this is widespread. The question is that, okay, so this again, this beta RTT var plus 1 minus beta. So I could have written RTT var new and RTT var old, like we were writing new. And old. Fine, this is also kind of moving average kind of a thing. But what about absolute value of SRTT minus R? This is no way this is variance. This is neither variance nor standard deviation. Another question is why suddenly it is 4 multiplied by RTT var? This is also questionable. Okay, that why are you measuring the deviation to be 4 times this metric? Now, there is some history to it. These were proposed by Jacobson in his 1988 paper, and then it became widely deployed. He proposed that our calculation scheme, remember this is 1988, okay, I mean computers at that time, personal computers used microprocessors, normal personal computers, normal desktops use microprocessors which couldn't even perform floating point operations, and they required extra chips on the motherboard to perform floating point operations. Firstly, so it is better that you avoid floating point operations as much as possible. Secondly, try to do everything using integer arithmetic addition, subtraction, and shifts, which are these instructions are available in all microprocessors. Okay, more or less. These choices of the parameters 7/8, 3/4, then 4 times RTT var, these type of parameters, then this absolute value of SRTT minus R, instead of performing a variance calculation and then taking a square root, calculate the standard deviation. All this lets these to be implemented quite easily using a few machine instructions. Finally, those of you who have taken computer architecture would appreciate how easy it is to perform this. And I would invite you to read Jacobson's 1988 paper to see the tricks that he proposed by which these calculations involving SRTT and RTT var can be simplified and to use only integer addition, subtraction, and shifts. They are suitable for lightweight devices. Even I mean, if the computation is lightweight, and they are suitable for resource constrained devices. This is again becoming fashionable nowadays with the advent of these IoTs and this type of Internet of Things and all these devices. Okay, again, these things have become very relevant. So good that TCP has kept on adopted this around the time it was proposed, and then it got widely deployed, irrespective of whether TCP is being deployed on a server or on a personal desktop computer, on a laptop computer, or on a mobile device or an IoT type of device. It doesn't matter. Okay, this is very important if you think about it, right? I mean, uh, you have to kind of uh, keep in mind that whatever you are doing should be implementable quite easily. Okay, so please read that paper if you are interested. Fine. Now one question comes. Till now we have said that the RTT estimation, all we have discussed till now is assuming that the value updates will happen when the segment was sent and it got its acknowledgement got back in time, so that you can get an estimate of the round trip time. What happens when a segment is lost and it is retransmitted again? So if it is lost, it will be retransmitted. That you waited for the entire round trip delay interval. Okay. What will you do? Will you for the new segments that have been retransmitted, will you use them in your updation of the values? There is something called Karn's algorithm proposed by somebody called Karn. He proposed that do not use update any estimate of these variables and RTO values on any segment that has been retransmitted after timeout. So do not base your estimate on what finally they will probably get transmitted and you will get an acknowledgement. But just remember that these are retransmitted segments. These were retransmitted segments. So don't base your estimate on this. Why? The insight is that first of all, you have to understand why was that segment retransmitted. That segment was retransmitted because currently, maybe temporarily, your network has become slightly congested. So that segment did not reach probably the receiver, or it is taking too much time, or its acknowledgement did not get back in time, or its acknowledgement got lost. Many things, bad things can happen. But overall, something is wrong with your network currently. Okay. So if that is the case and you are forced to retransmit that segment, please do not use it for your estimations, because this variation or bad behavior of your network performance might be a temporary phenomenon, might be a noisy phenomenon. Do not let that affect your estimations, because this might pass and your network might settle down again to a standard RTT level. Okay. So this type of short-lived, temporary, possibly issues with your network should not let your estimations be affected. So this was Karn's algorithm. However, you have to react to the event that a segment was lost. Okay, you have to react to it. That you have to acknowledge that yes, something is wrong with my network right now. How do you acknowledge that? You don't let the retransmitted RTT values affect your calculations, but the timeout interval is just double. Okay, for each successive retransmission of that segment. Okay, until it gets through for the first time. Only for that segment you say that, okay, fine, I will not let the measurements for this segment affect my overall RTT RTO values. Okay, but now that I am retransmitting, I will double my timeout for every successive retransmission of this segment. Okay. Until the segment gets through for the first time. This problematic segment, finally when it goes So this is, so I will now have two parallel calculations. One is my global SRTT RTO type of calculation, and the other one is calculation for this type of problematic segments which are being retransmitted. So this is also widely deployed. Now there are other TCP timers other than the retransmission timeout timer also. These are called, some of them are kept here, like mentioned here, persistent TCP timer, which avoids the deadlock when the receiver buffer is announced to be 0. Remember, in the previous topic, we were discussing a situation where the receiver buffer is 0. Then the receiver buffer, some space is freed and the receiver sends an acknowledgement to giving its window update that I have some space free in my window, so you can send it. However, that acknowledgement is getting lost repeatedly from the receiver to the transmitter. In such a case, deadlock might happen that the transmitter is waiting for the receiver to send an update and nothing is coming, so I will not transmit. However, when this happens for a long time, a persistent TCP timer which parallelly runs, that kind of runs off. And when this timer goes off, then the sender, it forwards a probe packet to the receiver to get the updated window size. It just pokes the receiver, maybe with a 0 size data packet, or maybe a very small packet, 1 byte of data or something, and asks the receiver, hey, what happened to you? You are not sending me any window update, and okay, it cannot send any data because the window, it knows that the window size is 0. So it just sends a header only TCP packet asking the receiver, please react to me. Okay. So please let me know what is happening. So in that time, again, the receiver will send an acknowledgement because the receiver will acknowledge whatever it receives. So it sends an acknowledgement on which the window size is piggybacked, and then the transmitter will know. Maybe even that will get lost. Then another persistent TCP timer, again it will time out and again it will be poked. And maybe after a few times, even if there is no response, maybe finally it will be the connection will be terminated. But that's like, it can happen, as we have seen that. Connection termination gracefully is a very difficult business. Because of the 3-army problem, there is no satisfactory solution to it. Then there is this keep alive timer. Okay, this is another timer. When a connection has been idle for a long duration, okay, you just check with the other party. What is happening? I mean, say persistent TCP timer is also not getting any response. Then you invoke the keep alive timer. This is even more time it takes. Persistent TCP timer maybe goes off after 30 seconds. And keep alive timer say goes off. I'm just giving examples. Say after 10 minutes you have not got anything from the other side. It's not that the other side window is, maybe the other side window is non-zero. So you could have sent something, and the other side you send something acknowledged, but then the other side has suddenly become silent. So you kind of ask, what do you plan? Do you want to continue or not? Okay. Now no response is still coming. Keep alive timer goes off, you just close the connection because you say that, okay, keep alive timer went off. I asked the other side, keep alive timer went off means I waited for a long time, relatively long time. Still no response from receiver. Okay, fine. Let me just terminate the connection. Okay. Then there is a TCP time wait interval. Okay. So this is basically during the final phase handshaking, okay, of closing a connection, you wait for some time, like this handshaking, right? So suppose this acknowledgement M+1 and this after the FIN packets, this should have come, but these are not coming back. You kind of unilaterally you can probably disconnect. So that is often uses a constant multiple of the packet lifetime. Okay. So that you can wait and then you can close the connection. So other TCP timers are always kept. Now, another important topic, which is that we have discussed and we have mentioned this, that in TCP, because every entity is independent of each other, until all of them behave properly, it is very, very difficult to keep connections congestion free. So if everybody behaves properly, then only everybody will get reasonable service depending on the available bandwidth. Otherwise, everybody will suffer. So one of the ways by which the sender respects the ability of the receiver to receive data is through the receiving window. The receiving window is informed to the sender through piggybacked on the TCP segments. There is a field about the window size through which the receiver tells the sender, don't send me more data than this. I cannot handle it currently. I don't have space in my buffer. This is one. But other than that, the TCP sender also is self-conscious that it itself has to be careful about whether it is unnecessarily loading the network or not. See, there are two factors. One factor is the party with which I am directly communicating. TCP is point to point exactly between two parties. There is no more than two party TCP connection. Every TCP connection, there are exactly two parties. One of them is that the receiver window information is just sent by exactly the party with which I am now communicating. Right. But I should also behave about how I look to the rest of the parties who are possibly sharing the same network infrastructure, although I am not directly communicating with any of them. Let me give you an example. Suppose you are talking with your friend while being on a bus or a train where like there are other fellow passengers in public transport. Suppose you start shouting, you are not happy about something and you start shouting on the phone. Your friend might react to it saying, why are you getting so agitated? You calm down and you lower your voice, because he is not liking what you are imposing on him, right? But at the other time, your fellow passengers who are sitting beside you, they might also tell you that, look, you should behave yourself. This is no way to talk in public. You are in a public place. This is not your home. You are not sitting in your drawing room. You should not speak in this tone and in such high voice. So then you say, okay, and you calm down and you start talking in a lower voice. So this is a two-way. This is a two-way mechanism. Okay, there are two different ways by which you have to behave yourself. One is you are being told by the party with which you are directly communicating, and the other is you have to be self-conscious that you are dealing with other people, other parties also who are sharing the same infrastructure with you. So you cannot do whatever you want. TCP maintains a congestion window that the number of bytes the sender may have in the network at any point of time. it calculates something called a sending rate, which is the congestion window divided by the round trip time. Okay, whatever the estimated round trip time or whatever, or maybe the measured round trip time. Now the sender window is the minimum of the receiver window and the congestion window. This equation is a very important equation. What does this mean? This means that first of all, your sending window cannot be more than the receiving window. That is well understood. We have seen this type of this example, that when the receiver tells the sender that I can only accept 2 kilobyte of data in my buffer, the receiver sends 2 kilobyte, not more than that. So there is no point maintaining a sender window more than 2 kilobyte. Okay, so its maximum limit is the receiving window size. Now it is restricting itself even more, and it is saying, well, I will keep myself less than the receiving window size, no problem. That will be my upper limit, but I will keep it even lower, maybe to something which is something called a congestion window. Okay. This is my estimate of how much byte I should push into the network. This is different from the receiving window. If the network currently, by my estimate, is in extremely bad shape and in a congested mode, I will not push in too much data. Even if the receiver tells me, okay, you give me 2 kilobytes of data. But if I calculate that my congestion window is 1 kilobyte, even if 2 kilobyte is available, I will not send more than 1 kilobyte. Because if I send 2 kilobyte, the receiver might process it, no problem, because it has 2 kilobyte free space in its buffer. But the problem is network will not be able to process it too well. The network will get overwhelmed because according to my own estimate that I should have sent not more than 1 kilobyte. So the connection, the TCP sender behaves itself. It kind of restrains itself and sends only 1 kilobyte. Okay, so this congestion window now controls, other than the receiver advertised window size or RWND, the congestion window also controls what is going to happen.
Sir?
Yes.
The sending rate should depend on the sender window size, I think. Because it is only depending on congestion window size, then we can send more than what receiver can receive. That is unnecessarily loading the network for everyone, right? Yeah, here the sending rate.
Yeah, maybe this will be sender. Right. I'll still check, but yeah, it seems, thank you for pointing it out. It seems it was a typo. Again, yes.
So how does this congestion window is calculated for the sender?
Which one?
So
How is the congestion window calculated? This CWND.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, we are coming to that. So why did this happen? Well, initially people thought that if I have a window-based control, and that will take care of whether I am going to send too much data to my receiver or not. If I take the window into consideration, then there will be no problem. But then as the number of users started growing worldwide, this other factor of how I am behaving or what my behavior looks like to the other people also, other parties also were sharing the same network bandwidth, that started getting important. Around 1986, the growing popularity of this networking, it wasn't, well, you shouldn't call it exactly the World Wide Web, That is a different concept which probably came more into existence maybe from 1990s, but still internetworking was increasing. Okay, even across countries it was happening. So this led to the first occurrence of something called congestion collapse, where a prolonged period for which the output dropped a lot precipitously to more than a factor of 100. This again prompted this von Jacobson's work 1988, which we have already discussed. He said that it is not only sufficient to concentrate only on the receiving party's ability to accept packets. You should now also concentrate on what is the situation of the network. Unfortunately, how to know the situation of the network? Firstly, there are two main challenges that Jacobson faced. First of all, do not do anything that affects the existing implementation of TCP, okay, or the protocol. I mean, if you change the protocol wholesale, then it is going to be very difficult. Again, that has to be implemented in software and then integrated to the operating system kernel. Rather, you can make some small changes, patch type of thing to the protocol, some small change to the protocol and do a patching on the software. If that works, that is better. Some small change, first of all. Secondly, how do I know that there is congestion in the network? This is a major problem because I am not directly interacting with any other party. I am only interacting with the receiver. Try to understand the problem. When you are talking, say, on a mobile phone during a very busy time of the day, it might happen that your voice quality is slightly worse than when you are talking at, say, 2 in the night. Just because the number of mobile users currently using a shared bandwidth of your service provider is less. So you have more bandwidth per connection and you get better voice quality. This can happen. So the signal to you that there is congestion is not direct. It's an indirect signal through a worse voice quality. Similarly, in TCP, if a packet loss or segment loss happens, that is a signal for congestion. Okay, if repeatedly timeouts are happening, then that's a signal for congestion and you should react to it. And you have to now tune the congestion window. Okay. Now, another important thing is a very interesting thing. Okay, by the way, so von Jacobson suggested that we will change the congestion window based on AIMD, which we studied in the previous topic. Okay. Now, one of the thing is fine, but then we require some numerical values actually of what should be the rate at which packets can be sent and what is congestion, etc. So one of the interesting observations he made was that, well, the rate at which acknowledgements are being received is a good indication of how much fast data transfer your network can support. Why? Well, say between the sender computer and the router, there is a very fast link and you like push segments like anything because you have a very fast, say, fiber optic cable available between this. Unfortunately, between the router and the receiver, the network is quite slow. Okay. And because the network is quite slow, the receiver receives the acknowledgement packet at the slow rate and receives the packets at the slow rate, and it sends back acknowledgements which can only travel over this bottleneck slow link at a slow rate. Finally, it goes over the fast link, but by that time already these acknowledgements have become slow. The fast link has no problem in transmitting these acknowledgements back to the sender in a fast way, but your slowest link of the network sets the upper limit on what can be supported. Do you understand? It is not the fastest part of your network. It is the slowest part of the network which determines congestion. So congestion will happen at this router or in the connection between this router and the receiver, because the link is between them is slow. It is not as fast as maybe an fiber optic cable or something. It is much slower. Maybe this is a wireless link. You don't know, right? I mean, this is shown to be a wired link, but maybe it's a wireless link or something. So the moral of the story is the acknowledgement returns to the sender and about the rate that packets can be sent over the slowest link in the path. This is a very important insight. Okay. So you will react to congestion window adjustment based on the rate at which acknowledgements are received. And we will follow AIMD. Now the question is, how is this value CWND? How will we do? There is concept that is used is in TCP is called slow start. Okay. The name slow start is very confusing. Okay, as you will see, it is it is not actually slow start. It is exponential increase initially of the congestion window. After starting from a value 1, okay, it starts very fast, but it is called slow start. Okay, and we have to live with it, and we have to live with it, and we have to be careful that you interpret it properly. One problem with AIMD is that if you directly from the very beginning you adopt AIMD, the CWND actually starts from a false small size, like say 1 or something. Then to reach the good operating point, something close to optimal, it takes a long time. An example is this: a 10 Mbps link with 100 millisecond return trip time, extremely reasonable. Both these parameters are very reasonable practical values. Then the approximate CWND is the product of them. Okay, bandwidth delay product is 1 megabit. Now, if you assume 1250 byte packets, 1250 has been chosen to make the calculations simple. Okay, it will be like approximately 100 packets to reach the bandwidth delay product. So it can support 1 megabit amount of data in the network. Okay, because the bandwidth delay product is that 1 megabit. But then about 100 packets are required. So you will start from 1. CWND starts at 1 and then it increases 1 packet every RTT. Then to reach 100, it will require 100 RTT. Okay, which means 10 seconds will pass before the connection reaches a reasonable load and a good optimal use point. This is too slow. Okay, we are not happy with it. So we do not adopt it and we adopt something else which causes exponential increase of rate, so that the slow convergence of AIMD is avoided. So initially we will not use AIMD. We will use AIMD for CWND after certain amount of time. I will show you with a plot. Initially we will not use AIMD. We will be very aggressive and we will use an exponential increase in rate to avoid this slow convergence problem, but we will call it slow start. So this is quite peculiar. Okay, the basic mechanism is you double CWND every RTT. That's why it's exponential. Let us see how. So the goal is that for every acknowledged segment, you allow 2 more segments to be sent. Okay. So every segment that is acknowledged before, of course, before the retransmission timer goes out, the segment adds 1 segment's worth of bytes to the congestion window. Very carefully look at this plot, okay? Because later on just after a few slides, we are going to look at something else, which is slightly different from this. This is not AIMD. This is slow start exponential increase. This slow start exponential increase sounds like an oxymoron. I mean, it doesn't make much sense really, but this is what it is. So there is a TCP sender and TCP receiver. First, the TCP sender has set CWND to 1 and it sends 1 packet. So here receiver has kind of set it, say its window to 4 or something. Okay. So it sends 1 packet. So everything is in terms of packets, not amount of bytes. In actual TCP connection, it will be in terms of bytes, but whatever. Just consider it into constant site packets for simplicity. 1 packet is sent that is acknowledged within 1 RTT. When that happens, CWND is immediately increased to 2 and it sends out 2 packets. Within another RTT, these 2 come back. Now for each of the acknowledgements that have come back, it immediately increases CND by 1. Because 2 acknowledgements have come back, effectively CND increases by 2 from 2 to 4. Then it sends out 4 packets. Then in another round trip time, all the 4 acknowledgements come back as within a very short interval of time, 5, 6, 7, and 8. I mean, a short interval of time, 4 acknowledgements come back. When they come back, as soon as, because it reacts to every successfully received acknowledgement, it keeps on increasing CWND by 1. So what happened, because it now received 4 acknowledgements, the CWND increased from a value of 4 to 8. So within an interval of 3 round trip times, it has increased from 1 to 8. So 2 power 3 for 3 round trip times. So this is exponential increase. Okay. And then pipe might become full, which means that, well, it has reached probably the RWND limit, and so it cannot, anyway, it cannot increase anymore. Okay. So it has to wait. Okay, this is unfortunately called slow start. But is this too aggressive? Well, so many packets you are sending out, that also might be bad. So you set something called a slow start threshold. Okay. It is initially set to the bandwidth delay product or arbitrarily to a high value. And that's a maximum that a flow can push to the network. And finally, when a packet loss is detected, the SSH threshold, this value is directly abruptly set to half the congestion window value, current congestion window value. Okay, I should say the current. There is a nice plot to explain all of this. I will not explain that. I'll not be able to explain the entire plot now. I will again need to go back and tell you what is happening. I mean, repeatedly we need to switch between slides. So look at this plot. This scheme is called TCP Tahoe. Okay. Tahoe is the name of a place and a lake in USA. Okay. This is in Utah, around, I think, the Utah state. Several versions of TCP came out. What is the history behind naming these algorithms with respect to city names in that region? I don't know, but there are 2 very, very common TCP congestion control implementation. One is called TCP Tahoe and the other is called TCP Reno. TCP Reno is better in certain aspects, but I will not discuss it in this class. It is there available in many textbooks, Tannenbaum, Coros and Ross, whatever. If you want, you can have a look at it. It's a modification of this. But let us first understand this TCP Tahoe scheme. Firstly, note that how the congestion window increases. Here, the packets are of size 1 kilobyte. Okay. Ignore the text that is written on the top of this plot. I'll explain them later. First, just look at the plot. Here in y-axis, you have congestion window, CWND, kilobyte. And this axis is the round trip time measured, or yeah, I think it's the round trip time measured actually. It can be the smooth round trip time also, but I think it's actual raw RTT. Now what happens is that you kind of increase exponentially. Okay. So you have a staircase pattern because in kind of every one RTT you get acknowledgements, and according to the slow start scheme, you start increasing exponentially. So this upward arrow showing slow start is kind of the theoretical asymptote to this slow start exponential increase line plot. However, in this case, arbitrarily, the threshold SSA, this is so slow start threshold, SS threshold was set to be 32 kilobyte. When it reached 32 kilobyte, it switches from slow start exponential increase to AIMD, classic AIMD. Now we will go back to it. But look at this plot, okay? I mean, look at the counterintuitive name. Clearly, this is an exponential plot, and then it switches to AIMD with much lesser slope. But this is called a slow start. This is peculiar. I mean, anyways, we cannot do much. But this is how it is. Now, when it goes to AIMD, CWND estimation or update changes. Instead of one segment per RTT increase as it was happening, it now performs a fractional increase of CWND per RTT. Okay, so say it is something like maximum segment size MSS square divided by existing CWND, something like that. So this is CWND new equal to CWND old plus, so it can be something. Oh, it is not working, but anyways, I'll correct it later. Somehow I cannot select this D, only this D. And anyways, it's okay. Okay. Where in this case, the MSS is 1 kilobyte. So that gives to this type of an plot. Okay. What is the resultant timing diagram? Now, there is an additive increase in CND. Earlier, CND was getting increased by 1 on every successful receipt of acknowledgement. Now it is not that aggressive. On a bunch of received acknowledgements, okay, it just increases by 1. So for example, CND initially it is 1, after 1 RTT it increases by 2, up to 1 RTT it is the similar to slow start. But then when all these acknowledgements come back, it just increases by 1. Then it increases by 1 more for all this bunch of acknowledgements, then increase by one more, etc., etc. So it will not send out packets like 2, 4, 8, etc. It will send out packets. Maximum rate is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. CWND can be 5, but then if your RWND is 4, it cannot go to more than 4. So now how will I understand that even in under AIMD there is has been congestion? Well, RTO is it's an indication of congestion. If the RTO value increases, then congestion is happening, but it keeps on updating on every successful received of packets following some equations, and it to get an estimate that RTO value is becoming very, very bad, it might take some time. Okay. TCP, another important aspect of TCP that can be used to indicate congestion is duplicate acknowledgement. This we have studied, right? That was just to refresh your memory. Yesterday we were studying that if say byte number 3 was missing, okay, and 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. bytes reach it, TCP receiver will send back acknowledgements telling that my next expected byte is still 3 because that was missing. Okay, 4 is sent, it is received, it sends back asking for 3. 5 is received, it sends back another acknowledgement saying I'm asking for 3 again. 6 it receives, sends back an acknowledgement saying I'm asking for 3 again. It will keep on asking for 3 because it has not received that byte in sequence. Okay. This type of duplicate acknowledgements received from the receiver is the sure sign that packets in between or segments in between have got lost, and therefore there might be congestion. Okay, so this is a kind of an indirect, very roundabout way of sensing congestion, but it's not much you can do. You cannot go, I mean, TCP, you cannot go out to the network and see, okay, let me see if there is congestion in the in the routers between me and the receiver, between a Google server and YouTube and me. There's no way you can do that. The only thing you can do is to see whether duplicate acknowledgements are coming back and whether it is taking time to get acknowledgements back. Taking time we have already studied. Now is the other option. Taking time to understand that it is taking time, it will take even more time. So it is quite slow. Duplicate acknowledgement is an alternative. TCP arbitrarily assumes that 3 duplicate acknowledgements for the same segment that imply a packet has been lost, and it triggers congestion control. Packet has of course been lost, but it triggers congestion control now. That is, it's seriously bad situation. Okay. The identity of the lost packet can be inferred from the duplicate acknowledgement. As we saw later, there 3 was missing, 4 was received, but acknowledgement came back asking for 3. That means 3 is the missing guy. Okay, so that can be easily inferred who is causing the problem. So it just retransmits the lost packet and it triggers congestion control. In this case, what is congestion control? Well, the congestion control is the point at which under AIMD you detect there has been congestion. You first of all, you just set CWND drastically down to 1. Okay, just let it go back to its initial value 1. Forgetting everything, all this. I mean, when you went back, you were at your congestion window was at around 37 or so. But still you decide that, well, I will go back to 1. And you set the congestion threshold to be half of the point from which you had to return. So this was close to 40 maybe. So it set it to half of 40, that is 20 kilobyte. And then from 1 and you again perform slow start exponential increase. So you allow slow start exponential increase, but your CWND drastically falls to its initial value of 1, the minimum value possible. And your threshold, you let it go up to half of the point from which you had to fall.
Sir?
Yes, any question?
What is the point of reducing it so drastically when packet loss started only around 35, then
Right.
why do we reduce it so much?
Exactly. Very good question. What is the point of reducing it so drastically? I mean, this is too bad, right? That's why TCP Reno does not reduce it too drastically. It reduces to somewhere mid in between. And then again, it increases like this. Okay, so let me try to project that. Let me find out the slide with a sawtooth-like waveform of TCP Reno. Just wait. So people were not happy that why exactly this question they said asked. It took some time to understand, but they did eventually understand that this is, I mean, this is too conservative. So they came up with another alternative version of TCP congestion control where the scheme was called TCP Reno. Let me find the plot and let me try to show it to you. TCP Reno follows a different scheme. It sets SSH threshold to 1/2, retransmits fine, but then it sets CWND to SSH threshold plus 3. This type of another choice it makes. And the sawtooth thing looks like this. This is packet loss, congestion is set in. This was at 40. I will set slow start threshold to 20, but I will now start from 20 plus 3, 23 or something. This is called fast recovery. And again, I will perform AIMD. So effectively, this is additive increase, multiplicative decrease, but the multiplicative decrease is not that drastic. Okay, like the TCP Tahoe. The TCP Tahoe was like this. And TCP Reno is much more of a sawtooth type of waveform. Good, very good. So future version of TCP, maybe some TCP Kharagpur will come out and then you guys would propose it, which will be even better. So good, very good. So you have already got the insight that everything is not perfect. There can be better ways. People have implemented or proposed better ways. Different implementations of TCP implement things differently. You have to look at your particular operating system and its particular implementation of the network stack to know exactly which version is implemented. You can study about TCP, search on internet about TCP Tahoe and TCP Reno and get a list of operating systems which support whatever. TCP Tahoe is very old. I doubt whether it is used that much. Even TCP Reno probably is not also used that much. Things have changed, but they have become more successively more and more complex. So we'll not go into those sort of complications in a first course. Okay.
Sir,
Yes.
sir, in the estimation of round trip time or the RTO, So in today's world, can't we use any learning models to learn those things?
Possibly theoretically, yes. Practically, you have to see how well. So will that be a global model applicable for every possible network scenario,
Sir,
or it will be a connection specific model? For this particular connection
no, sir.
session, you will have the model.
Sir, if we maintain it global, means the history
I
will.
doubt whether a global model for all types of connections in all type of traffic scenarios would be very useful, or whether at all it can be implemented. Secondly, the inference has to be really fast, assuming that the model has been built using a lot of computational expense, lot of data set, and you have spent sufficient amount of computational time in training it, and finally you have built a model which is quite accurate. You have to deploy it on devices. So you have to ensure that the learned model can infer and give you a value prediction in fast time. Then which is exactly opposite, which is basically not the exactly opposite, which is basically the same motivation as von Jacobson, who implemented it using only addition, subtraction, and shifting. Integer addition, subtraction, and shifting. So it has to be a lightweight implementation of the inference. And I think that probably can be done. I mean, there is a lot of work on edge computing and lightweight artificial intelligence implementations on edge computing devices. Probably if the model has been built by buildings by spending a lot of computational power somewhere, then that can be deployed. My concern is whether it will work in the same way for every type of devices, for every type of connectivity, ranging from a fast Ethernet based connection to wireless connection to even weaker
Sir,
connection possibly.
if we make it to learn with the incoming time, so in the wireless, it will learn to means some different learning will be there, and in some different machine, some different learning will be there.
The problem is that one computing device does not communicate with uh, one type of computing device all the time. You can communicate with, you can sit on your home with a fast broadband internet access and chat, do a real-time chat with your friend who is using a relatively low bandwidth, maybe 4G connection or something like that on a smartphone, in a location where probably the connectivity is not that good. So for that, you require one model. And then when you are communicating with a device which also has good bandwidth, you require another model. All this might make life tough. I don't know for certain, but this, I mean, yeah, of course. I mean, it looks to be an obvious thing to explore whether this can be deployed. But probably it's an overkill to use machine learning for this if with such relatively simple schemes that TCP uses currently, you are getting decent results. See, one thing you have to understand, TCP is a kind of, by computer science standards, it is an old protocol. TCP was developed in the 70s. Okay. The only 70s technology in day-to-day use in computing, at least in academic computing that I can think of, which still exists, is C programming language and the Unix operating system concepts. Even the implementations of Unix, which were done in the 70s, and their variants which came out in the 80s and 90s, are no longer used that much. Linux has displaced several different versions of Unix. Okay. The operating systems that Microsoft or Apple used to offer in the early 80s are all gone. Does anybody use DOS nowadays? MS-DOS, which came out probably in 83 or 84? No. Does anybody use computers which run the original Apple operating systems? No. The Apple product line still exists, but the operating systems have changed. TCP has evolved, but TCP has not been replaced. That's the beauty of it. Okay, it is so well thought out that it is available for every known operating system, every common operating system. Something becomes a global standard because of reasons, not because arbitrarily. Okay, there are reasons why they become global standards, and they set the standard for everything else. It is, and once it becomes the standard, it becomes very, very, very difficult to replace it. In home computing, traditional consumer and business computing, I'm saying business executive computing, not professional business computing where you need to write and deploy code. I'm talking of just day-to-day usage of computing in business and home. Why is Microsoft Windows so popular? Is this the best operating system? Many people will argue, no, it is not the best operating system. MS-DOS was horrible. The early versions of Windows were all horrible till probably Windows XP had certain degree of respect. Then successively it increased in quality with Windows 7 and then this Windows 10 that is quite popular nowadays. But is this the best to become so widespread? No, but the thing is, what are the other choices you have to look at? People, those of you who have used Mac, they will argue Mac is much, much smoother, much better. Once you get used to Mac, you don't feel like ever coming back to Windows. Fine, but Mac is expensive, right? And the other option is Linux, which is still probably not as user-friendly for an average home user as Windows. For many things, it requires a command line operations, etc., for successful operation, which home users cannot do. So that's the thing that Windows targeted. That there is a large population of home users who are not that tech savvy, but who want to use computers for day-to-day use, and let us target that market. So Bill Gates said that one of his major goals of developing Windows and the entire philosophy of developing MS-DOS and then Windows was that he said, I wanted my mother to be able to write down and save her home food recipes in files on my computer at home, on a computer at home. Now, I cannot teach my mother programming. She is not tech savvy. But she wants to use a computer for whatever service it provides to it for her advantage. She wants to store her recipes on a computer in an easy format. So that gave me the thought that I will now come up with a computer which even a lady who is not tech savvy will be able to use. It will be able to open a file, easily type in a recipe, format the text if needed, and will be able to save that file on the computer and will be able to retrieve it later on if needed. So it's a simple thing. Nowadays, we take it for granted. In the early 80s, unfortunately, that was not the situation. Computer was limited to a very, very select tech-savvy population. From that, Bill Gates wanted to kind of deploy it to everybody, to open it up for everybody. Okay. So once something becomes very widespread, it is very difficult to completely replace it. Okay. And when does something become widespread? Well, it becomes widespread when it has some distinct advantages which nobody else can match. Maybe some other things that many other protocols have been proposed. For example, I am not covering something. There's a protocol called QUIC, which is a variant of TCP, which Google has developed basically. QUIC. Okay, it has certain desirable features over TCP, no doubt, but it has not replaced TCP completely. Okay, that well, deploying machine learning models for this type of relatively simple schemes is probably an overkill at this point. Maybe people have already done it. I'm not a specialist in that domain, so I don't know. I'm neither a specialist in machine learning nor a specialist in computer networks performance modeling. Maybe you can ask Professor Shondeep later on when he teaches this question. He will be a better person to give you the answer. But at this point of time, given that TCP has been deployed for so many years over billions of wide-ranging devices, I would say probably it is still doing a good job with relatively simple schemes, and maybe it is not. Maybe I mean, it will take some more time probably, but yeah, I mean, it's of course an idea. Machine learning is getting deployed in other fields or domains also. For example, I work on the hardware side, so there are applications of machine learning in digital circuit testing that is coming up. Digital circuit testing is a notoriously difficult computation. Okay, I mean, given a collection of logic gates, if you are asked that you generate a test pattern at the input or input pattern which will cause logic 1 or logic 0 at some particular internal input node, this problem has connection with the satisfiability problem, which is not easy to solve. So heuristics have been proposed over the years which work decently well for most circuits, not for all, but for most circuits. Now, for circuits for which these heuristics do not work, some peculiar types of circuits sometimes, these corner cases, people have said, okay, we'll use machine learning to come up with this. And these schemes are to an extent successful. Okay, to an extent, but for circuits for which these heuristics do work, people argue that it is an overkill. So for 95% of the circuits, it's an overkill. It takes too much computation time. You should stick to the heuristics, because for 95% of the cases, the heuristics will generate the test vector in lesser amount of time. But for the remaining 5%, heuristics will completely fail. It won't generate anything at all. That's true. Within a decent amount of runtime, whereas your machine learning model will maybe give you something. But whether you want to adopt that for those 5% cases is questionable. Anyways, let's come back to our own topic. Just for the sake of completeness, UDP doesn't have any window acknowledgement, nothing. It only has very simple Again, following this 4-byte arrangement, it has a source port, destination port, message length, there is a checksum, and there is some data. It doesn't provide any reliability, it doesn't provide any sequence number, which means that order is not guaranteed, nothing is guaranteed. So you might be surprised, what is the use? Why the hell is UDP used at all? Well, the question is TCP is this window-based flow control. It leads to bursty bulk transfers. It is not rate-based. Sometimes burst, sometimes nothing like this, because it depends on the window, CWND and RWND. Okay, sometimes you can send a lot of data, sometimes you cannot send much data. The slow start algorithm, it can reduce throughput. Initially, you are starting with 1, although it is increasing at exponential rate, but initially it is very, very slow. TCP has extra overhead per segment. It has a lot of extra data. Some of them are not used, but still you have to carry them. UDP can send small, efficient. I shouldn't say. But UDP, on the other hand, is that they are kind of, you can just consider UDP to be is just a network layer protocol with a very thin transport layer header. Okay, so it kind of looks to be like some data combined with some header, and it is being sent out at a constant rate. UDP doesn't care. There is no window-based flow control. It just sends out packet at its own happy way. Whether those packets will reach the destination or not, whether they will reach at all, whether they will reach in order, any acknowledgement from receiver, it has no expectation of anything. Okay. So it does keeps on pushing out packets on the network in a happy, merry way. It's not good because you cannot use it for reliable data transfer. It can cause inefficient datagrams also, because there is like inefficient in a sense that the inefficiency can come back, it can be in 2 ways. One is the sizes of the data is kind of small chunks. So per segment, per packet or per datagram, you are not transferring too much stuff. And secondly, it is inefficient because it is pushing a lot of stuff on the network without any concern about the reliability of the congestion state in the network. And those segments are not reaching the other side. So this is wastage of the entire network infrastructure bandwidth in a certain way. Okay, so but TCP is complicated. Okay, TCP is quite complicated to implement. UDP is okay if your application can work in the presence of certain amount of unreliability. One of the examples is this voice chat and video chat that we are performing. Possibly the traffic that is being generated from my computer and what you are receiving through this video call are UDP datagrams. The reason is that human vision and human audio system, the auditory system, they can tolerate certain amount of unreliability, jitter, by kind of interpolating between received information and making up and kind of smoothing the information received. Of course, if there is too much disturbance, then it gives up. I mean, you get you kind of your visual system says that okay, the video is really bad. But a certain amount of unreliability, some missing frames in a video, 30 frame per second video, some frames are missing, some frames have come out of order. This type of things it can tolerate. Voice also is probably the most tolerated, I mean, what should I say? Inaccurate voice is probably the most tolerated thing. Our ears can tolerate even very poor voice quality also, and understand, our brain can make us understand what is being said from the other side. So all these features make UDP attractive in situations where lot of traffic is generated, but the receiver is tolerant to certain amount of error. For example, this type of multimedia communications. Finally, there is a checksum calculation in both TCP and UDP. A 16-bit checksum is calculated. We have not discussed how it is done. It is in TCP, there is a pseudo TCP and UDP header data. The checksum field is first of all initially set to all bit 0, and then a pseudo header is built. Then with the existing header and data, everything together, a checksum is calculated using 1's complement arithmetic. Okay. This reserved 8-bit, whatever is mentioned in the pseudo header, I think this reserved 8-bit is maybe used for protocol number.
Sir, you forgot to share slides, I think.
I did not share. No, I think I shared the slide.
No, sir, they're not visible right now.
Oh, so you have not seen anything of TCP, UDP. Okay, so UDP datagram is like this. It has no window, nothing. Okay, very sorry. No window, no acknowledgement, nothing. Just source port, destination port, message length, checksum, and data. Okay. UDP traffic looks like this, kind of constant rate pushing of traffic in the network without bothering about anything. No window based control, no feedback taken from the network to indicate congestion. No concept of acknowledgement, no concept of receiver window size, no respect for anything, no rules basically. No guarantees about reliable transfer of data, no guarantee of in-order transfer of data. If the receiver application is okay with this type of unreliable service, for example, in multimedia type of applications, it is fine. Otherwise, you cannot use UDP. However, given that multimedia traffic nowadays is probably 90% of or more of the total traffic, YouTube and all these video chats and everything, especially since lockdown worldwide, lot of traffic is being generated, which are multimedia traffic and this type of voice chat and video chat traffics. UDP is very important. It probably in terms of traffic volume, probably I don't know what is the comparison between UDP and TCP, but probably UDP might be actually more in volume than TCP. Complexity of application. TCP is much more complicated. I mean, by now, I think you have understood TCP is complicated. If you have not understood that TCP is complicated, then you have not understood TCP at all. Okay. So, yeah, so probably the comparison is too far-fetched. But this is I think what Einstein said about the general theory of relativity. So Einstein said that if you think it is an easy theory to understand, that means you have not understood it. Okay, so it is not easy. UDP also has its own peculiarities. It is not the most satisfactory solution, but it is much simple. Finally, one checksum calculation. This checksum, 16-bit checksum, is present in both TCP and UDP. I will not go into the details of how this calculation is performed. Something called a pseudo header is built along with the header plus data. Initially, in the pseudo header, you would need in the checksum fields of these headers, that is set to all bit 0, and then the calculations are started. Some 16-bit value is calculated, put in the field, then it is set on the receiver side. On the receiver side, another calculation is performed. Okay. So TCP and UDP have their own checksum. Finally, IP again has its own checksum. Okay, so this additional layer of verification in TCP and IP happens. The details of an example calculation, the arithmetic that is used is one's complement arithmetic. One's complement arithmetic, I don't know whether you have studied. It is not that common. For your convenience, I have uploaded a 4 or 5 page note on Moodle, which shows how the checksum is calculated. It is quite peculiar, not very difficult to understand, but it is peculiar. Okay, I mean, the one's complement arithmetic itself is quite peculiar. But you will understand it if you understand hexadecimal characters and binary, addition, then you will understand how this calculation happens. That you can have a look at it. That won't be in the syllabus. Okay, but it is important for the full picture to know that such a calculation is done for every TCP segment that is sent, and when that TCP segment is received at the receiver, or UDP segment is sent and received at the receiver. First, you perform the checksum calculation to check that everything in checksum is matching. How do you know checksum is matching? Well, it is a very clever scheme. First of all, what is the correct checksum value? The receiver has no way of knowing, right? So how do you know that things are in order? You can compare with the expected value, but what is the expected value? The receiver does not know. So what they do is that at the receiver, the calculation is such that you will, if everything is in order, you will get all 16 bits to be zeros. Only then you say, yes, yes, there is no problem. Every time, whatever was the original value of the checksum, it doesn't matter. There is a calculation at the receiver whose final result should be all 16 bits 0. If that is the case, you say, yes, everything is in order and I will now process it. So this is a very, very, very important step to do. Okay. Regarding the structure of the pseudo header, you can have a look at the book by Tannenbaum, and also on internet there is a lot of examples. Detailed example of if these are the contents of the pseudo header or of our TCP segment headers, what should be the pseudo header, and then finally what should be the checksum and what should happen at the receiver when the checksum is received. Okay, so have a look at it. That more or less ends our discussion of the transport layer. Next, we'll move to the discussion on network layer and the IP protocol. That will be after your spring break, which is next week, I believe, because spring break Monday and Tuesday will be inside the spring break, so we will miss the classes. So from second week of March, your discussion of network layer will start, and Professor Sandeep Chakraborty will take over. I might come back towards the end of the course to cover data link layer, but I am not sure. Okay. So if I do not come back, this is kind of my last theory class with you on this subject. Of course, there will be another class test. We will let you know soon when that will happen. Similar format like the previous two ones. So thank you. And today's convocation, the medical college is going to be inaugurated by Prime Minister. So I think you have got the YouTube link and everything. So it's about 9:45 now. So I think we can break. Thank you.
Sir,
I'll now stop the recording. Yes.
One doubt was there. During the congestion thing, do the directly connected routers share the information about congestion?
Yes, they do, but not in a TCP mode. There are other ways to, well, TCP can also indicate congestion to certain fields. There is something called explicit congestion. This ECE field, this is sometimes used to indicate congestion. These are relatively new variations of TCP, which uses this flag and then some additional options to indicate congestion. Congestion can be indicated at the protocol level, both at the transmission transport layer and also at the network layer. And you will study something called ICMP probably later on when you study the network layer, when routers can indicate congestions happening. So the brief answer is yes, but you would need to wait for exactly how it happens.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.